It's the 30th of August, 2021, and I'm standing here in Green Hill Cemetery in Waynesville, North Carolina. Downtown is that way, right over that knoll, Main Street, Waynesville. This is one of the oldest cemeteries in Haywood County, and I have, well, at least the earthly remains of a lot of relatives of mine are buried here, going back generations. Here's where it all started for me when it comes to history, especially local history and family history. For reasons that I cannot explain, when I was a kid, I became interested in my family and would ask my grandfather, Papa, Bill Winchester, so many questions, and he would tell me everything he knew. What I discovered in some of my questioning of family members was that my great-great-great-grandparents, Daniel and Phoebe Winchester, were buried here at Green Hill, but nobody could tell me where. And we scoured this old cemetery, at least the old section of it, and spent a lot of hours up here just looking from one headstone to another until there came that day when I finally was able to locate them. Daniel and Phoebe are buried here. This headstone was placed here by my great-great-uncle, their grandson, Lawrence Winchester, because for many years they lay here in unmarked graves. But he knew where they were buried. Family told him very clearly, and so he placed the marker here himself in the early part of the 20th century, at least the mid part of it. Daniel Winchester was born in 1800 in South Carolina. He died here in Haywood County in 1888. His wife, Sarah Cazalaroo Irwin, likewise born in South Carolina, died here in Haywood County just a short time after her husband in 1889. We do not know where the name Cazalaroo came from. If anybody watches this and you're able to tell me, I'd sure appreciate knowing, because that's one mystery I've never been able to figure out. What we do know is that even though she had the names Sarah Cazalaroo already, her father thought, because when she grew up she was still very small of stature, and that as she was growing up he thought she looked like the little Phoebe bird. And so he called her Phoebe, and it stuck, and she's been known as that ever after. She and Daniel married about 1826 in South Carolina, and by 1828 they had a young son, Jonas. And because of an epidemic that was sweeping through the area, Daniel decided to get his family out of there and move further into the mountains. And so he loaded Phoebe and Jonas up on one horse, and all of the belongings he could get on another horse. He walked and led them up over the old Cherokee trading and hunting path across the mountain, coming out in what is now Rosman, North Carolina, and then eventually making their way through what is now Brevard. There was nothing there then. Remember, this is 1828 or thereabouts. And then eventually on up the mountain, following the basic path that US 276 now follows, until they came to the place called the Pink Beds. Now, of course, they would have gone past Looking Glass Falls and Sliding Rock, places that are known to many who visit the Pisgah National Forest, but they settled further up the mountain in what is now known as the Pink Beds. And when they got there, they had to get up a cabin and make bedding. Now, it had frosted, they said, and the crabgrass was deadened. And Phoebe said that crabgrass made the best bedding, and they stuffed it in what material they could find to make their bedding, and they slept on that. But when they brought in that crabgrass bedding, the rats moved in, and the mice. Thankfully, somebody in the area gave little baby Jonas a cat. We don't know who or why they thought that baby needed a cat, but it was a good idea, because that cat took care of the rodent problem, and that cat multiplied. There were about 30 kittens, I think, by the time they moved from there, and they did that by 1830. And they located here in Haywood County. They came up across Wagon Road Gap, down through what is now Crusoe and Bethel community, and of course those names were not known then. But they came through there and came to Waynesville, and there was a Mr. Brown in Waynesville that directed them toward the Balsam Gap area and a tract of land up there in what is now known as Walker in the Hills, also called Winchester Creek. And that creek is named after these Winchesters, Daniel and Phoebe, because they homesteaded there and raised their family. They lived and did well there. not only did they farm, but they also would put people up when they came up the old highway there going to and from the area that is now Jackson County. And eventually, when the Civil War came, unfortunately, they lost 4 sons to that terrible conflict. James was the first one who enlisted in the North Carolina 25th Infantry Division. Just an interesting footnote, James is buried here because he died in Grahamville, South Carolina. They placed his body in a coffin and shipped him back home. Somebody had to go meet the wagon down past Morganton and bring him the rest of the way here. Buried him in this plot. He actually attended a worship service with the rest of the North Carolina 25th Infantry Division in a church building that was located on this property. And so, led by a Presbyterian minister. And so we know those men heard the gospel before they left. I've got a record of a summation of the words that man shared with them before they left. But James ended up being buried here. His wife, Rebecca, buried beside him in this cemetery plot. That's his white marker there that's now corroded. And then there were others. Their son, William, enlisted with the 29th North Carolina Infantry. He saw action during the war, ended up down in Mississippi, was captured in or around Yazoo City, was taken prisoner, and he died in a Union prisoner of war camp in the North. And then their son Laban, who tried to enlist with the Confederate Army, was turned down because he was too young. He decided he wanted to fight anyway, and so he made his way over to Tennessee. Now, nobody in the family knew what happened to Laban. He left here, and that's all they knew. Somebody reported seeing him in or around the area of Mount Sterling in the Cataloochee watershed. That's the last report they had of him. What the family never knew until I discovered just a few years ago is that Laban actually made it. He made it to Tennessee, enlisted with the Union Army. He was wounded outside of Atlanta during that battle, and he died there in August of 1864. I remember when I found his grave outside of Marietta, and I was able to say at that point that I had finally found out what happened to all of my grandfather's family. When I started out, all I knew about was my great-great-grandfather, Papa's Grandpa Winchester. But the rest of them were all a mystery to me. I had their birth dates, but no death dates. But slowly over time, I found one after the other, thinking I would never locate Laban. But I'll always remember standing at his grave that day and thinking I'd found him. Now, that was no mystery to the Lord. The Lord knew that all along. But even so, it was an important moment for me. In the meantime, one other son, Josiah, left here in late 1864 or early 1865 and enlisted with the Union Army in Cleveland, Tennessee, the 5th Tennessee Mounted Infantry of the Union Army. As far as I know, he saw no action. He died of pneumonia in Tennessee and is buried outside, or rather in the U.S. military cemetery in Chattanooga. So in a short period of time, between 1861 and 1865, Daniel and Phoebe Winchester lost 4 sons in that horrible conflagration that was the Civil War. Phoebe eventually drew a pension because of her son Josiah's service. Had she known it, she could have received compensation for her son Laban's death, but no one knew. And then one fall day in 1888, Daniel was walking in the dog trot between the cooking cabin and the cabin that they lived in over on County Line Ridge in Sanook, and he fell and he broke his hip, and he became an invalid and was bedridden, and he died soon thereafter. Phoebe, who was heartbroken and not the best of health, died a short time later in January of 1889. And so these are the 2 that Winchester Creek was named after here in Haywood County, and whose family spread far and wide. Jonas's family, many of them eventually ended up settling in what is now Swain County, Bryson City area. Others wound up in Washington State and in many other places. But here's where it started. I was just trying to track down the Winchesters, and now all these years later, I'm doing these videos on Facebook. And I have a grandson named Winchester and another one named Sutton, all because of old family names. And God is good. And may He bless you always.